The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and a warm welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl Martin. You're listening to the Mindful Medic podcast. Warm welcome if you're joining us for the first time. I do apologise, there has been a brief hiatus between episodes. I did actually record this conversation a few weeks back, but work and life have transpired against me sitting down to edit and produce, which is probably not a bad thing because I thoroughly enjoyed re-listening to this conversation this weekend. I think it is one of those conversations I will revisit time and again and get something different out of it. It is a longer episode, so I think I am going to be brief in introduction and let you hear from our guest.
The practice of medicine bears no resemblance to the practice of medicine 30 years ago. We don't use the same tools. We don't even have all the same diseases. We certainly don't have the same treatments. So I think we need our education system needs to catch up with how we know people should be educated. Our training system needs to catch up with how they should be trained. But over all of it, if we have wellness-centered leadership and we're looking at the people involved in doing this, and we take care of the people, they'll work within the systems and they'll find a way to get their training and their knowledge and step into that next version of what being a practicing physician is. And they'll do well at that. And it will be very different than what I stepped into or what you stepped into and not because they're a new generation, but because the world is a different place. There's published data that shows that the behaviors of the leader impact the well-being of their colleagues that they're responsible for. And the things the leader has to do aren't give them a lot more money or give them a lot more help or give them a bigger office. The leader has to support what they want to do and acknowledge a job well done and keep them informed and, help them develop their career. So I think that, some of my favorite conversations with my GI colleagues were, what title do you want on your business card? What title do you want on your curriculum vitae? Tell me that. What do you want to do more of? And let's find a way for you to do more of that. Because people who get to do what they want to do work really hard. They're very productive. And so you can view it any way you want. But if you want people to be productive, I know what they want to do, what really brings them joy, and I know a way to get them to do that.
You have just heard from today's wonderful guest who I'm really honoured and delighted to welcome to the podcast, Dr. Daniel Murphy. Dan is a Professor of Pediatric Cardiology at Stanford. He's notably the course director of the Stanford WellMD Physician Wellbeing Directors course. And, that was where our paths first crossed in October last year, albeit via a virtual platform. I was fortunate to be a successful applicant for the course, and I cannot recommend it more highly, particularly for listeners who maybe have a hat or remit as a wellbeing director or a portfolio for their department. Both Dan and Rachel, who co-direct that course, offer a real high quality content and experience. Stanford are able to offer that course thanks to a very generous charitable donor. And Dan is also the co-director of the Department of Wellbeing Directors Council and also a co-director of the Stanford Wellbeing CWO course, which many of you know I then went on to do this year in person. And, you know, really welcomed the opportunity to sit down and actually speak to Dr. Murphy in person. And, you know, I think that he is someone, you know, I think like all good teachers, mentors, really makes me think, and probably I leave with more questions than answers. But he's really encouraged some self-reflection in me, and particularly how I use the work and the knowledge that I have gained through courses like this, and you know what I'm going to do moving forward. And you know, many of you know that this season 3 of the podcast has a real focus on leadership, and I think this idea of wellness-centered leadership, which you know is aligning with what we've discussed before, the Wellbeing 2.0. I can't think of a better person to explore this with than Dan. So, you know, I'm not going to say too much more. I'm going to link many of the references here in the show notes. I'd really encourage you to jot some things down. There's a good 90 minutes of conversation here, which is very rich with pearls. And, you know, I'd love you to contact me. I'm certainly keen to explore many of the topics that we discuss here with anyone who's listening. Enjoy. I am really delighted to welcome Dr. Dan Murphy to the podcast this morning. I think I gave you a little teaser last week, and I'm delighted to had opportunity to speak to him before, but a further opportunity to speak again in person is very welcome. I know that your expertise and perspective is going to be very welcome, particularly for this audience. So you're the director of the Stanford Healthcare Wellbeing Directors Council and the director of the WellMD and WellPhD Physician Wellbeing Directors course, which I was fortunate to participate in last year. And I think I said that, you know, I found, even though there was a couple of hundred participants on that course, the virtual platform was actually a very intimate experience, thanks to yourself and Rachel. And, you know, I know we're going to go on to talk a bit about community, camaraderie, connection, those breakout rooms, and the opportunity to share conversations with colleagues, I think was one of the most powerful parts of that course. But you have extensive experience and clinical background as a pediatric cardiologist. And so by way of introduction, I'd actually love to know what led you to your chosen clinical career path, and particularly at what point physician well-being became a focus for you.
Yeah, it's really great to be here with you, Cheryl. Thank you very much. I'm enjoying it and looking forward to our conversation. It's funny how things happen to us. I'm not a big believer in stepwise approach to my life or my career. I think it's cycles and sometimes unexpected twists and turns. I always worked with kids. I came from a big family and was around kids a lot, and taught and coached. And halfway through university, I sort of changed my direction. And I was primarily interested in that point in mathematical science, thought I might teach it. And for some reason, medicine triggered my imagination. I don't know why exactly, but I like the problem-solving aspect of that. And I like the involvement. If I went into medicine with the idea that if I became a physician, I'd work with children. And
Yeah.
So I ended up in medicine, ended up as a pediatrician. And, what I learned is that I'm not smart enough to know everything about everything. So I honed myself down to the smallest next sub specialization I could. So that at least I knew a lot of things about very little. I knew a lot about a small area. And, but even within that, and, I had a long career, and there I was an expert in Kawasaki disease. I was an echocardiographer, an imager. I developed our program here in adults with congenital heart disease. And, each of those was a new area that was interesting to me. And one of the great things about medicine is you can actually do whatever you want if you have the courage to do it and you have the curiosity. And I got bored. I liked doing new things and I liked new challenges. So, medicine for me was not one thing. It was a series. I worked at several places and I really evolved my career based on what was available and what was interesting. Even leadership, came along a little bit later. But even that was sort of the next challenge. And I'd go in logical transition from teaching and training, which we do in academic medicine, to, okay, I can take care of one family or one kid, but what about the next generation? And what can I do to help the next generation of people become better physicians and more better adjusted? The wellness issue came along late because I don't think we as a profession recognized. We knew, I think many of us who trained in the age of despair knew how bad 100-hour weeks were and knew that there were times when we felt really terrible, and maybe ascribed it to long hours or lack of support. But I really hit a wall a couple of times and physically and emotionally felt that emotional exhaustion and just how to put one foot in front of the other without the support that I needed. And, sometimes there are problems that are so huge in medicine that it just wears you out. And I certainly got worn out at that point. And my way to deal with that was a personal way to begin with. I undertook some mindfulness training and trained in mindful self-compassion and read a lot about resilience. And with the help of a coach, really got myself in a better place. It also helped that I got a new boss about that time, which, by the way, is a huge challenge. Leadership is a big need for all of us. We need supportive leadership. And it's so weird. It's funny how things happen. So I was at a meeting, an evening meeting for evolving leaders and in our organization. And I was a more senior person, and they had an icebreaker that said, you put this on your sticker on you that says, ask me about ... Ask me about my grandchildren, my vacation to Darrow, my, my knitting, whatever. And I put, ask me about mindfulness. Now, I was not a meditator. I wasn't a practitioner particularly, and I don't know why I put it down there. But all these people wanted to talk to me. And one of the people that was there that evening was involved in the Dean's Task Force that had just been formed at Stanford to address the issue of physician burnout and well-being.
What year was this?
2016, 2015, 2016. And they had a mindfulness working group. And she said, you should be on the mindfulness working group. So I went to that, and I was the only non-meditator in the mindfulness working group. But it was interesting. And I met the people who were forming WellMD at Stanford at the time. And I was around when the Dean's Task Force gave their recommendations, and the university supported the concept of actually creating structure around physician well-being. And they asked me to be involved in that leadership. They asked me to be involved in interviewing the candidates for our chief wellness officer and creating some of the structure. And so my leadership roles that I'd had before sort of led to a role with the formation of WellMD, which was actually already in formation, but I never would have predicted it. So it's one of those things, opportunities come up, but it certainly resonated with me. I I'm an efficiency expert. I was the medical director for our clinics for a long time. And I love efficiency. I love making things better. And it was clear to me, and one of the things that we learned is that Toyota and the Toyota production system and lean, the basis of that is respect for people. And if you respect the people doing the work, you get good quality work, and they'll make the work better. So that was built into my training and my leadership. And then what came along, to tell you the truth, was this model that Stanford had developed, the professional fulfillment model that you've seen with the three domains of culture of wellness, efficiency of practice, and personal resilience. And it really resonated with me because I knew that if you've got good leadership and a good culture, and you can make the practice of we can make the practice of medicine more efficient, so we're able to do the job we're trained to do, we're going to be fine. We'll have a great day, and our patients will have great outcomes, and our colleagues will be fine. So this whole thing sort of came together and resonated with me in terms of, let's respect the people doing the work. Let's support them. And then maybe we don't need to worry quite so much about other outcomes that will logically follow from that.
Yeah. Wonderful. What an introduction. And there's quite a few things that I want to pick up on through the conversation. I think up front and center, just before we get into some of those specifics, I normally ask this at the end, and it strikes me that I really should be asking this up front, and particularly with you, it seems relevant. What does well-being actually mean to you professionally, personally? They might be different. And has that changed over time? I imagine it probably has.
Yeah, well-being, I think I would subscribe to a broad definition of well-being. Certainly being healthy, as healthy as possible, emotionally, physically, cognitively, mentally. But I think well-being in the broader sense means to be supported and resilient, to be effective and functional, be relevant. As a physician, we have so much opportunity and to a certain extent, so much expectation. Well-being professionally to me means, can I do the job that I was trained to do? And while I'm doing it, feel good about it, feel valued and feel reinforced. And overall well-being, I sort of think it has to do with that balance in life. I'm from a generation where I don't think that I resented the hours I spent at work. That's what was expected. But at least that was what I was doing it deliberately and intentionally. And so I often think well-being is, am I in a position where I'm an agent in my own life? I have control over my own life. I'm doing what I want to do. Because I think that too many of us become victims, or we feel like victims, or we feel trapped. And it's pretty hard to be fulfilled in your profession. And at Stanford, our goal is professional fulfillment. And that also means personal fulfillment. So that self-actualization within your career and within your personal life, to me, that's what well-being is. And so it's a broader definition of, and it's not just emotional health either. It's physical health and it's intellectual satisfaction. I love learning new things. And it's one of the reasons that I stayed in academic medicine. I just love being around the young people who are learning, and to be part of whatever the newest, most interesting thing is. So that's, to me, well-being is to be fulfilled in those areas.
That perspective that you have, because it's pretty obvious to me, and you had a couple of niche areas through your career. You have seen taken opportunities, that sense of having some agency and interest. I keep thinking as you're speaking of, Albert Einstein, there's two ways to live. So there's nothing is a miracle as if everything is. Do you think that Do you think that was unique? I mean, did you see, I mean, what was the perspective, I suppose, of your colleagues through that time as you moved and changed and pivoted? Because I think that is something that is becoming more important as a theme for clinicians today and becoming more accepted. But I don't think it was necessarily the norm in the past. I'd love your perspective on that.
No, I think you're right. And probably for me personally, the turning point was probably that self-awareness. And the word mindfulness probably is the best definition in terms of listening to that inner voice and hearing what it's saying, not necessarily believing it, but understanding that's what's going on, and having the pause that Viktor Frankl talks about between stimulus and response to say, okay, here's the stimulus. I can choose whatever answer I want as a response, whether that's a response to something in my career, or how to respond to my spouse when I walk in the door. To have that level of pause and awareness, I found that to be a significant change for me. Became less reactive and more intentionally responsive. And I think for all of us as physicians, things come at us pretty fast. I mean, you're in emergency medicine, but even then, whether you can pause and take a breath before you walk in to see that next patient, or before you respond to a colleague or another clinician, that can make a huge difference in terms of how that interaction goes, and or how you view it, or what impact it has on you. So I would say that, and again, my mindfulness practice has always been very informal, generally momentary, so-called 0-minute meditations, more along the lines of Thich Nhat Hanh, of when you're washing your hands or you're at a stoplight or something, that's your opportunity. I didn't really have time or patience for a lot of formal stuff, but I certainly built those habits into my daily life, that I'm walking from one place to another and I'm breathing a certain way. Ron Epstein has an exercise in his book. He has a book called Attending, which is about physicians being present. And there's an exercise in there called 20 minutes of red, or 30 minutes of red, or something. And the challenge is to go for a nice quiet walk someplace and notice everything red, and pay attention when you first do it. Write it down. Just notice that. And it's kind of funny, but it's helpful at Stanford because our red's our color. Everything's red at Stanford, but and car tail lights and license plate. But it's just a little exercise to center you, ground you, going from one place to another. So I think that's the building block to being more intentional, more focused, more in charge of my own life and career. It really starts with how do I respond in the moment to those things that are coming at me.
So you have introduced this model that Stanford WellMD have developed that we can use when we're thinking about organizational well-being and developing and improving professional fulfillment for clinicians. And it is something that I have made reference to on the podcast previously. And, I really like this model, and it focuses on 3 main domains. So the individual, the culture of wellness, and the efficiency of our practice. And, I think listeners have previously heard me say that, I think a lot of the work is in the domains of the culture of our practice and certainly the efficiency. But, we know that it's easiest to start with individually tailored programs. And I think I'm becoming more at peace with knowing that, I think if you're thinking about offering as a wellbeing program director individually tailored programs, you need to have a buffet of options. And, maybe any one particular tool or program is only going to suit 15% of your staff, but it could be particularly important for that 15%. And I know that you've started to bring in some of the tools that you sought to cultivate for yourself. And I'd love to explore a bit more about your experiences. So, I find the mindfulness conversation and fascinating. And I know that you've shared with me a bit about your work in doing some training in self-compassion, and I'd love you to share that with listeners. But I also, would love your perspective on, the other big ticket items that we should be seeking to incorporate, develop when we're thinking about our departments and our organizations in terms of individually focused tools.
Scaling these practices is challenging. Quite frankly, I think that we need to put it into the schools. It's like a lot of other things in our society. We need to start pretty early in life to get young people reading and get young people acting a certain way and about thinking about themselves in a certain way. I think part of it comes with modeling that sort of behavior to being authentic. The self-compassion piece is I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would never have started a conversation in our echo lab about a mistake that I made. I never would have done it. I would have hoped nobody else would have brought it up either, and hope it didn't end up at an M&M or some conference. But I look back, I can think of a time within the last couple of years where I made a mistake. I made a misdiagnosis in the operating room. It made a difference. I felt terrible about it, but I also felt the need to share that with my colleagues. And it was amazing because I shared it with them deliberately as a modeling exercise. And yet it ended up being the most amazingly gratifying support that came from these folks. And we learned something. We also made things better because that was an error, not because I wanted to make it or because I'm sloppy or lazy. There were reasons why we could have done better. I could have done better. We could have done better. And as a group, we came up with ways to change the way we practice so that perhaps those errors would be less common. And so, it's how do you... I unfortunately, with the self-compassion piece, I don't know, Cheryl, because I don't think that I recognized it before I went through some formal training. It just wasn't natural. It didn't come naturally to me. I think that physicians were chosen because we don't make mistakes. We've chosen because we get perfect scores on tests, and the system weeds out those people who make errors or who allow themselves to make errors and allow themselves to be human. So it may be that the best way for us is going back to that is to start a little earlier and not just choose people who never make a mistake, because there's no such person. Let's not pretend that the people we're choosing and bringing into medicine are perfect people. And I think we've done that. And I think our educational system and our training system has very low tolerance for errors, even when there's system errors.
Yeah.
I can remember coaching. I was a baseball coach, so just in case you don't know that, baseball's a sport we play here in this country.
Yeah, no, I've watched baseball. We don't have
very arcane, not as arcane as cricket, but very, very arcane. So I was a baseball player and a baseball coach, and I coached a lot of teams, and my teams did very well. But the teams did well because we focused really on physical skills that anyone can learn. And I never, ever, ever chided someone or criticized them for a mental error or something that they couldn't control. If they could control it, that was their responsibility, and they could learn from that. And, I think we all make mistakes. So I think that, so I was going to tell you the story. I don't know if you want to hear the story.
Definitely want to hear the story.
I tell stories. No, it's, so I went to this, I signed up for this mindful self-compassion training. It's the Kristen Neff version of self-compassion training, because we had done a study at Stanford with some physicians, and it had a huge impact on them. It decreased burnout. They were much more satisfied with their careers. It was very effective. And I felt like I needed to learn more about this. I knew about mindfulness. I had no idea what they were talking about with self-compassion. So I signed up. It was 8 weeks or something, 2.5 hours a night on a Monday evening, and plus a whole day retreat. And I went, and it was okay. It was, I won't even describe the group. It was about 15 people, and we sat in a circle, and I did the exercises. I paid attention. And after about the third week, my wife said, "Why are you going back to that thing? You don't seem to like it." I said, "Well, I don't like it, but I said I'd do it, so I'm going to do it." I'm pretty stubborn. And I went for the whole course and the Saturday retreat. And it was all right, but it didn't seem to make that much difference to me. In fact, I was the guy asking the question of what's the difference between self-compassion and self-indulgence? Isn't this just being indulgent? Why don't we just suck it up and be toughened? So I was a quintessential person like that in the course. But I did the exercises and I kept doing them. I wrote a nice evaluation for the trainers. And about a month later, I don't know, I wish I'd written down where I was, what I was doing. All of a sudden, something flipped in my head. I could almost feel a different neural pattern kick in where I heard something, I either heard someone say something or I thought something, and my response to it was 180 degrees from what it would have been a month before. I thought, oh, well, that you don't have to view it that negatively. It doesn't have to be that negative. Let's reframe that in a way that sounds much more constructive. Maybe there's another way to look at that. And it just changed the way my brain works. And there's plenty of functional MRI data to show that people who meditate, people who do this, have different neural patterns. And I actually think there are ways for us to reprogram our brains to respond differently to someone who says, "I'm no good at that." I can't hear that anymore. I mean, when I hear that from someone, there's this upswelling of compassion in me, which is, let's think about that. That can't possibly be true. So what's really going on? What's the basis of that? And can we reframe that in a different way so that it's much more constructive? So, again, those are things. And as a leader, to be able to hear other people, what they're really saying, and help them not view themselves that way, has been great. We have a group of surgical specialists who last year undertook a task of trying to change the culture in their group. They have about 15 members of their division, a surgical subspecialty. And they did some training in self-compassion. They did some training on psychological safety. This came about because one of their trainees at the end of her training program said, "You guys aren't very nice to each other. You don't talk to each other very well, nicely. You don't treat each other very well. And it's sad because you're all so great. But I wonder if you could change that." So they did. They listened, they changed it. And over the course of the year, they did these trainings. They changed the way they structured their morbidity and mortality rounds. They changed the way that the language they used during their conversations with each other and the division meeting. And at the end of the year, they like we, finished our annual survey, had the largest decrease in burnout of any division in the School of Medicine. And they didn't spend any money on it. They didn't bring in a lot of expensive speakers. They didn't hire 16 more nurses, but they changed the culture of their division. They also didn't work on personal resilience. This was not a personal thing. This was how does your group deal with each other? How do you feel about yourself with respect to your colleagues? So very, very profound. And this is not outside the realm of possibility for people and their groups to accomplish.
Fantastic. I think listening to that, I'm reminded of the recent paper that you co-authored on wellness-centered leadership, caring about people always, cultivating individual and team relationships, inspiring change. Intuitively, this makes sense to me. I'm thinking about the work of my colleagues, Eve Purdy and Chris Turner and Adrian Plunkett. And, I think all of this kind of coalesces quite nicely. And, I think this is a perfect segue to go on to talk about leadership. And, I think this season of the podcast has certainly had a leadership focus. You've already mentioned, your various roles as teacher, supervisor, coach. I'd love to hear your experiences of being coached, but you have had a number of leadership roles now. And, I'm curious to know, what your style of leadership is, what leadership means to you, and has that evolved or changed over time?
Yeah, I don't think it's changed very much. As I say, when I when I was coaching, as a university student, coaching little kids in sports, my focus was on those kids. It turns out that if you focus on them, the teams do well. So it was great that we won, but the focus was on the kids and the kids having a valuable experience. And so I don't think that was ever any different. As an Echo Lab director early in my career, I wanted really happy sonographers. I wanted people that loved their work and learned from it. And as a result, then they didn't leave and they stayed with us and they became really good at what they did, which made my job easier. I've never had very many positions where I was the boss, because there's a difference between being a boss and being a leader. And I was a manager for a while. Managing's a little different too. There's some HR implications and some other things. And some things you have to do as a manager that aren't really pure leadership. Yeah. But leadership, frankly, the easiest form of leadership is the leader that doesn't have any responsibility, that isn't the boss. Because then if people do things, it's because it's the right thing to do, not because you told them to do it. And even when you are the boss, better not to tell people to do things. Find out what they want to do and find a way to help them do it. I had a unique experience. A few years ago, our gastroenterology division had a leadership hiatus. Their chief retired and their search had not yet produced a permanent chief. And hospital and medical school leadership asked me if I would step in as the interim chief of the gastroenterology division. I'm a cardiologist, so this was a little bit different. And it was possibly the best leadership experience of my life because I couldn't do their job for them. I couldn't step in and, I really felt like Ted Lasso on the sidelines. I couldn't kick a goal. I could watch them and put them in the game and support them any way I could. And I guess what I learned from that, there's that article about wellness-centered leadership that I'm sure you can share with your listeners, which starts with, can start with people first and consider people always. And I would say that my feelings about being the chief of the gastroenterology division was to take care of myself first. And I think as a leader, that is job one. This is also, by the way, for those people on the podcast who like management and know the Toyota production system, and I'm a junkie with that, that's the number one thing for their leaders too. Development yourself, take care of yourself, get better at what you do. But then the next thing, 9 things on the job are to take care of your people, and develop them. And I don't think I have much of a leadership philosophy beyond that. I think that pretty much takes care of everything else. There's budget stuff and there's other things, but at the end of the day, it's all about people. And, and the good news is most of us went into medicine because we have something about that interaction with other people appeals to us. And, that's an advantage because not everybody has that. Some people have to learn it, and it can be learned, by the way. There's published data that shows that the behaviors of the leader impact the well-being of their colleagues that they're responsible for. And the things the leader has to do aren't give them a lot more money or give them a lot more help or give them a bigger office. The leader has to support what they want to do and acknowledge a job well done and keep them informed and, help them develop their career. So I think that, some of my favorite conversations with my GI colleagues were, what title do you want on your business card? What title do you want on your curriculum vitae? Tell me that. What do you want to do more of? And let's find a way for you to do more of that. Because people who get to do what they want to do work really hard. They're very productive. And so you can view it any way you want, but if you want people to be productive, I know what they want to do, what really brings them joy, and find a way to get them to do that.
Yeah. Simon Sinek last week. People don't leave bad jobs; they leave bad leaders.
Yeah, that's for sure. I used to say the only person I don't want to be my boss is the person that wants to be my boss. And I've been fortunate to have a variety of bosses, some better than others. So, like I always tell the fellows and residents, you learn from everyone. Sometimes you learn from people. That's exactly how I want to practice. And sometimes you learn, I don't want to do that when I'm in that position. But physicians are leaders, de facto leaders in all of clinical situations. We are looked to as leaders. We have responsibility that other members of the team don't have. And I think we take on that mantle of leadership willingly. And that's not a boss thing. I'm not telling the other team members what to do. I may write an order, but it's not really an order anymore. This is what I think our care plan should be, and here's how we're going to carry it out. So I think even a brand new, freshly minted physician can benefit from understanding what true leadership is and how leadership there is looking out for people. And they may be looking out for people above them on the ladder. They may be looking out for people who are interdisciplinary colleagues. But they're going to be viewed as leaders, and they'll be most effective when they act as leaders.
I think we've had the conversation a few times that many of us have found, and I definitely include myself in leadership roles, feeling ill-equipped and unprepared for them. And certainly you learn a lot on the job. But what you've talked about supporting and developing leadership, because I know Stanford have some really nice data around this, that we do need to get transparent in healthcare about how we develop and how we measure leadership. And I know that, you are setting the standard in that respect. What does that look like? And at its best, what could it look like? What should it look like?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, to tell you the truth. I don't know that it matters too much when we choose leaders. In medicine, we haven't always chosen leaders who have proven leadership track records or abilities. But I think it's a teachable skill. And let's face it, physicians learn a lot of things that they didn't know before they became doctors. So I think if someone wants to be a leader, the question is, why do they want to be a leader? If they want to be a leader because it gives them more money, that's a problem. If they want to be a leader because then they can boss people around, that's a problem. But assume they want to be a leader because they want to provide more and enhance their own learning and career. And it's not rocket science. It's there's those 9 questions of, did you listen to people? Did you ask them what's important to them? Did you were you transparent, sharing with them what you're hearing, what's going on? Did you find ways to support their career? I have had a phenomenal division chief the last 10 years who I thought this guy was actually reading these questions during our annual review. It almost seemed rote. And yet, even when he said it and read it, it felt like he was asking me. He wanted to know. So the fact that he even asked me meant so much to me. I didn't care if he asked because it's on the paper or he asked because he cared. It felt the same to me. And that's really what mattered. And I think after watching him for several years, I think he became much more comfortable with actually asking because he cared. But maybe he cared all along. It was just that I was getting used to him. But at the end of the day, the fact that he took the time to talk to me about what was important to me and then acted on it, because that's the other piece. You have to support people. That's what it took. And that relationship, that trust that we built, that respect was really helpful when there were things he couldn't give me, when there were things he couldn't do. He didn't have control over them. But I still know that he was supportive, even though he couldn't give me exactly what I needed. I knew it wasn't because he wasn't sympathetic, because he didn't care, because he didn't trust me to have the right motives. He did. It's just, that's the way it went. And, this really, Cheryl, this really speaks to our relationships as physicians with other non-physicians. I mean, there's been this term of reciprocal scapegoating where we blame healthcare administrators or nurses or whoever else that we don't think give us what we need, aren't sympathetic. And, I think if we get to know each other a little bit better, who is this person? Where are they coming from? And actually assume that they have the best intentions and start to build that trust with each other, I actually think we'll get more together out of it. See a lot of factions and fractures in medicine between clinicians and non-clinicians, between physicians and nurses. And I don't think those are necessary at all. But they really require alliances. They really require us to be allied with other people that we're working with.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think that some of the biggest challenges that we face relate to the silos that we work in, the tribalism. I think many of us are, increasingly pressured and fighting fire day to day, and it is head down. And, we've lost those opportunities for shared perspective. Which I know is so important if we are to build bridges and coalitions, create those connections. And, again, this is something that I think about, day to day. And I'm conscious that, on the background of these past couple of years, we are losing people every day. We're losing staff. And, this has become a critical work. So, I mean, I'd love, having gone through a couple of the courses, having, really sat down and thinking about this, there'll be other people listening who are in wellbeing director roles or, have organisational remits. What advice would you give to us, to them, when looking to start to build those critical connections and coalitions?
Okay, how about this as a challenge? How about if each week you try to meet one new person in the hospital that you don't know their name or you haven't spoken to them ever, and you grab them for 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, as long as they have the time, and at least you get to know their name, where they're from, what do they do, and catalog that, write it down, make a point when you run into them again to remind them of your name and get their name and ask them about something that came up. If you did that once a week, over the course of a year, you'd have a group of 50 people around you that a year before you didn't know your name, that you hadn't built any relationship with. Now, I'm not saying that's a panacea for this, what's happened to all of us in healthcare and what's happening. But how does it feel at the end of the day? How many of those little interactions do you need, even in a crazy busy emergency department where there's fires and codes and everything going on? How many minutes does it take to feel like you've got some connection with somebody during the day that mattered? And again, as a physician, we have immense power. So whether it's a medical assistant or it's a housekeeping person or it's a respiratory therapist or it's an administrator who happened to be walking by or a dietary person. I mean, what a joy to actually feel like we're part of that same team. So I would just say, as a bare minimum, maybe an exercise like that might start to make a difference in people's lives. We diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging is a very important priority for our organization and in many organizations. And it's been a tough few years for that too. I have a very simplistic view of that too. I think that let's focus on the belonging. And so if I work alongside you and I know something about you and we're working together, we know something about each other, that it feels like we belong here. We belong together. We're doing this job together. And yeah, there may be other misunderstandings that are bigger than the two of us, but it seems that that's the starting point that each of us can control. A lot of times we focus on things that are so big, they're outside of our control, the huge problems with healthcare, the disparities of health equity in our society. And they're worthy topics of discussion and emphasis. But within our own individual scope of control, besides ourselves, we actually have an opportunity to have an immensely positive impact on other people, which, by the way, does great things for us. Expressing gratitude and recognition of someone else gives the giver more benefit than the receiver. We've part of our lean daily management here in almost every one of our huddles throughout the hospital and the clinics, recognition, what went well yesterday and who did a great job yesterday. Bring that name up, write out a card that the leader signs and send it to them. I must say that my one trip to Australia, that would be the one thing, if I could imbue it in your culture a little more powerfully, is yes, give a attaboy, give a pat on the back, give a recognition to your colleagues. Yeah, they're just doing their job, but what they do is an awesome job. Yeah. And it goes such a long way. It's not, and it isn't kumbaya. It isn't, it's not soft. It's not soft. It's actually hard neurological behavioral science. Find a way to recognize somebody that's done a great job. And by the way, you'll feel better at the end of the day too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, interestingly, that was exactly the focus of last month's podcast with Dr. Adrian Plunkett, who's a paediatric intensivist in the UK, who set up the Learning from Excellence platform and movement. And that has had global reach. And my own colleague, Ray, has set up something similar in our organisation. Where we can call out everyday excellence. And I agree the science, the neuroscience behind this is fascinating. I think that we underappreciate the potential impact for this, and we, are more likely, unfortunately, in medicine to find out when we have made a mistake or someone thinks we have made a mistake or are in the wrong. I think building on that, and building this idea of community and connections. And I really like that idea of just going up to one person each day and somebody that you don't know in your workplace or organization. I think that's powerful and a great place to start. But I really like the work, originally from Mayo Clinic and now embedded in Stanford around commensality camaraderie groups. I read that Mayo Clinic proceedings, I think landmark paper, quite a few years ago now, by Dr. Tate Shanafelt and I think Dr. John Noseworthy. And, one of the organisational strategies that they used was about this building community and connection at work. And I read the Compass trial, so colleagues meeting to promote and sustain satisfaction. It struck me that I was doing something similar organically with colleagues, once a quarter, going out for dinner, breaking bread, having a little bit of discussion around the workplace, but then just sharing stories and the peer support that you get from that, I think is powerful and important. But here is putting a bit of science. I thought that the study itself was really nice, and a bit of funding around it, even more crucially. So, I'd love to know, because I know that is something embedded at Stanford now, your own experience of participating and running camaraderie groups, and the potential impact that could have for people interested in doing something similar in their own place of work.
Yeah, obviously this started at Mayo Clinic, and they've published their results, which were pretty powerful, considering how hard it is to demonstrate changes in well-being. This was a pretty powerful evidence-based exercise. And as you know, they started with giving some people time during the day and evolved it into lunch or dinner meetings. And for those of you who haven't read the articles, it's pretty simple. You get a group of 6 to 8 people, and we can share those resources as well. But get a group of 6 to 8 physicians, gather them for a meal. And our approach to this is, and this again started at Mayo, is spend the first 20 to 30 minutes addressing a specific question that's been handed to the group. And it might be, talk about a time when your work as a physician interfered with your personal life, or talk about a time when you felt particularly proud to be a doctor. We've got dozens and dozens of questions, which are the starting point for an honest discussion amongst physicians who rarely share these things together. And what's been found is that something magical about that experience of eating and talking and sharing just seems to work. This came out of the firefighters that were in the fire station. They sit around and cook and eat with each other, and they're very powerfully aligned with each other. And it works for physicians. We share so much. We go through so much that's traumatic, that's heroic, that's challenging, that's gratifying. And even the gratifying, we don't get to go out there and tell people, we saved a life today. Who gets to say that? We feel great about ourselves. No, we tamp it down, we go home. Yeah, good day at work today. Or the opposite. So getting these groups together, and I love the descriptions of when they rolled this out, there are all kinds of predictable objections. This is time away from home, away from your family. Who would think this is a good idea for doctors? Well, turns out that the spouses were frequently quite happy to have the physician's spouse spend some time with their colleagues, get out of the house and go. I think they probably recognized when they got back home, they were happier, they were calmer, they were adjusted, they valued that. Anybody who's had a party where there's a whole bunch of doctors there, what happens? All the doctors are over in the corner of the party talking about stuff. This is more time. It's time out of my family time, out of my personal. It's my personal time. Well, this dinners don't work for everybody. That's why sometimes we do it as lunches. At Mayo and at Stanford, we paid for the food, which is a small thing. But they also found at Mayo, after they'd done the study, even when they said we may not be able to continue to pay for the food, the groups wanted to continue to go out to dinner together, which I'm not at all surprised by. I mean, I think this is so. It's evidence based. It doesn't matter. It can be all women. It can be all junior faculty. It can be all gastroenterologists, or it can be some of their groups were just put together because somebody said, I want to be in a group, but I don't have a group of people that's already formed. So they threw some people together.
Perfect.
So, and again, why physicians? Not to be exclusive. That's not the goal. But I actually think being a physician is a unique experience. And this is the evidence. You could certainly experiment with multidisciplinary groups, for example, or a group of people working in an emergency department, or a multidisciplinary, or a group of people working in a unit. But it is interesting. I've talked to organizational psychologists who work in healthcare, and it's kind of funny when they put groups of nurses and doctors together. There are times when it changes the dynamic. When it was all doctors or all nurses, the conversation is very different when they're put together. So that would be something you'd have to study. But these groups are incredibly powerful, and it's not happy hour. It's not just let's go wine tasting. It's actually a much more serious undertaking. I like the term breaking bread. It's the term commensality is an awkward term rather than camaraderie, but it is communal, and it's something that we share. So we do it a fair amount. It doesn't tend to be vastly expensive. We've never imposed it on people. Yeah. They want to volunteer and put together a group. We can usually find a way to pay for it. And it's different than a book club. It's a little different than some of the other ways in which is immensely valuable. I mean, physician book clubs have been around a long time and people love them. I don't think there's been quite as much study about the impact of those on people's well-being. But there probably is some, or people wouldn't keep doing it.
I think I'm in 3 book clubs. I should look at putting some evidence around those. Maybe we can do our own little study there.
Yeah, we have a program at Stanford called Medicine in the Muse, which is groups of physicians getting together talking about writings that are medically oriented, highly popular. And in terms of people loving it, it's highly successful. I don't think that they've actually studied the individual well-being of the people that were involved in that.
One of my colleagues runs a a journal club that we have in a restaurant every quarter. And, it's not about the articles we necessarily discuss. It's really exactly what you've said. I did show him the Compass trial afterwards. I said, this is what you're doing here. And we've started to experiment with commensality groups and picking some themes to talk about in the first maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then just it's open forum.
It's interesting. One of the things the pandemic did, it changed people to virtual meetings. And there were some side benefits to that. Our orthopedic department used to have research meetings in person, and they were sparsely attended. One or two researchers would come, and there'd be a few clinicians. And the clinicians I talked to said they never wanted to ask questions because they thought they'd look stupid. And so there really wasn't much discussion. It was a presentation of a research project. Well, once they went virtual, the audience was much larger. A lot of people called in, Zoomed in, who weren't there before. And the people I talked to said, it seemed like they weren't the only one asking questions, so it wasn't so bad. And once it was okay and people were asking questions, the discussion became very lively. And the interchange between the research people and the clinical people became very robust. And they're now struggling with, what do we do now? Do we keep it all virtual, or do we run the risk of going back in person, not having people get there? But they found a change in their interaction based on getting a critical mass of people there in a setting where there was a little more trust. So we have another group that one of our group's divisions was a hospital medicine division. And so those people, they work shifts in different hospitals. They rarely see each other, a little like some of the emergency medicine people. And so they did some listening tours and asked people what they wanted to do to build community. And one of the ideas was, give us some time with each other at the faculty meeting that's not part of the agenda. So they did an experiment where they gave the first 7 minutes of the faculty meeting. They put people in breakout groups, like of 2 or 3, just a few people. And they called it water cooler time, like standing around the water cooler.
Brilliant.
And wildly successful. People loved it. They got to know each other. And after the pilot, which is always a good thing, if you want to try something new, rather than pose it, call it a pilot, make it time limited. They measured the satisfaction of people with this was very high. And so they continued it. It wasn't necessarily supported by the division leadership originally. That's why they did it as a pilot. But once they did it, I think there was recognition that giving up those 5 to 7 minutes was a very small price to pay to get people much more engaged. So they came now to the division meeting in a good mood, having talked to their friends, having made new friends. And now we've got a whole different situation than we had before. So, and that's something that, again, it was only happened because of the virtual platform. Their meetings before had all been in person, which was a real problem, because when do you have an in-person meeting for some people who some of them work nights and some of them work days? And there was all discussion about that. So I love being in person. Hugs are great. And I'm not one to say that the pandemic has a lot of silver linings, but learning that to have people be able to join each other in situations where they wouldn't have been able to otherwise, it's been an advantage. I think it's a challenge for a lot of leaders is, what do we do now as we come out of this and we're getting back together in person? What do we tell? Do they have to be in person? And do we make it hybrid? I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah. That's definitely been my experience too. And I think just on that, power of the virtual platform and sharing stories, I think I said to you that my life in thirds exercise, which I don't know if there's any literature links I could put in the show notes for that, but I think it's something very worthwhile for people listening to try with colleagues, because I thought that was very powerful exercise.
Yeah, I like it a lot because it doesn't take very long. And that's a little version of what I said, go out and just meet somebody for a few minutes. It's a little more formal than that, but it's essentially the same idea. It gives them more structure. To listen to somebody tell their life story in 3 90-minute segments and listening for their values and their purpose in life, that's amazing. I mean, how many times has somebody listened to you tell your story and say, this is what I hear. This is what I'm getting from your life. That's kind of powerful. It's sort of amazing. So I like that one too.
So just going back to that conceptual model from Stanford WellMD, I think we've very nicely, thank you, covered, the individual and some tools, techniques, strategies that we might seek to cultivate for ourselves or incorporate into programs for our colleagues. And then, just this last part of the conversation has very nicely been around the culture of wellness and things that we can practically do as individuals and teams to help build positive, supportive cultures. Because I do feel that that is the domain that we all can have influence over every day in how we show up and what we do at work. But then, we're left with this third, which I think is the biggest and big ticket item, the efficiency of our practice. It's the system stuff. And this is I think the most important, but big problems, big complex organizations and how you constructively start small as a small team or as an individual with a role in organizational well-being, and how you do this with impact. I think about this a lot. I think about the efficiency of our IT systems. I think about, things like the logistics of parking and childcare and overtime and, all of these things play in. But also there's a platform here in Australia called Creative Cures in Medicine. I've had the founder, Dr. Amandeep Hansra, previously on the podcast. You would love it. It's a fantastic forum. And, it has over 15,000 healthcare professionals on there now. And increasingly on there, there's this recurring theme of people who are exhausted, depleted, experiencing burnout, and trying to pivot out of their careers. And, I've noticed, particularly amongst the physicians, there has been, and doctors, there's been this there's been a theme of people maybe looking to retrain as life coaches or counselors or doulas. And, you get this sense of, I want to go back to doing something that I trained for. I want to make a contribution. I want to feel that I'm having that patient interaction. It's doctors getting back to doctoring, which, tells you this is not about the money. And, I think about this a lot. So, you've said that you're an efficiency expert. So I want to pick your brains. How do we start small here? If we do have a role as a department wellbeing director or even for an organization in a CWO role, what is your advice?
Yeah. So where to start? Truthfully, the big picture is we probably need to change that model of how we deliver healthcare. But not you and I aren't going to do that. But I think it's just too expensive and we aren't going to have the people to do it. So, looking at things that, what is the doctor doing that doesn't have to be the doctor doing that? Who else could be doing that? And how do we pay for that? And that's often a challenge when the money's coming from different sources. But I think that we certainly see successes in many areas where a group that has some control can say, okay, can we craft jobs for the people so that they're working at the top of their certification and their training? So they're doing what they were trained to do. And most of us have spent a lot of our career doing stuff that somebody else should have been doing. And that after a while, that wears people out because it isn't, and whether it's mandated by the government or it's just because of the budget and 2 nurses quit last week, so now I'm rooming my own patients or whatever it turns out to be. We really need to, no industry would have the highest paid, most skilled people doing menial work. They just wouldn't do it. It's a waste. It isn't matter it's demeaning. It's just a waste of money and a waste of of expertise. On a smaller note, one thing I wanted to insert is that our recent data, and you may have heard this, our recent data shows that improving the efficiency of practice only benefits physician well-being when it decreases the negative impact of our work on our personal relationships. So if I make your work in the emergency room more efficient so that you get your notes finished and get your last patient signed out earlier, so you get home, you leave work earlier, you're going to be better off. If all I do by doing that means that you can care for 2 more patients on a shift who roll in, and you still end up leaving at the same time that you were leaving before, and you still don't get home when you wanted to get home, we probably, even though we're more efficient, we probably haven't actually helped you. We may have made more money. We may have decreased the waiting time from the ED. We may have done a lot of good things, but for physician well-being, the major part of the improvements in efficiency that are meaningful are those that get us out to the rest of our lives, that keep our work from adversely impacting our personal relationships. So that sort of begs the question of, what are you doing during your professional day that if you did less of it or did it more efficiently or somebody else did it for you would help you with the rest of your life? And quite frankly, that's very different for people at different jobs and different stages of their careers. What matters to a person my age is different than what matters to somebody who's trying to get home and pick up their kids at daycare. What matters and what is it that they want to do? What is the rest of their life? So I think at that point, you have to get down to the individual and the unit level of what's the work that we're doing and how can we together, meaning all of us who are doing this work, somehow make it better so that we get to, sometimes it's just scheduling differently. And some of that's, I've seen groups of people redo their schedules in such a way that the work got done, and yet people knew when they were going to be able to leave, and they were much happier with the work that they were doing. Now, some of that's culture work. So this model, you can't take one domain and say this is that, because the model, each domain is influenced by the others. If the people running the show don't give you permission to make changes in how the care is delivered, whether it's moving things around or helping change what jobs people do, if they say no changes, that culture of inflexibility will keep you from making things better.
I actually find that a really encouraging conversation, because we're back to leadership again. We're back to what you said before about getting to know each other, asking each other, listening, as leaders, and empowering, and everybody trying to break down bridges each day by trying to have a shared perspective, because we do actually have a common goal in healthcare. And if we don't, we're probably not in the right environment in the first place. We probably shouldn't be there.
Good. Well, I'm glad. We need to be encouraged, that's for sure. We have to believe that things can get better, which is also one of the caveats, though, because the only way for things to get better is for them to change. And change is hard for us as human beings, even if it's change for the good. And we are all at risk for the inertia of sacred cows and the inertia of this is the way we've always done it. Sometimes leadership is more at risk because they're more threatened by those changes. But that's another part of that compassion, is recognize that change is really hard for people. I actually think part of what you're seeing with the pandemic and people leaving and wanting to get out is it's not the way it used to be anymore. It's unpredictable. It's chaotic. And people find that unsettling. I have a colleague, a physician colleague who works at Google part-time and works at Stanford part-time. She says they've been flooded with applications from physicians, the people that want to work at Google. And she said she was talking to somebody last week, and the person said, well, you just seem so happy, which, is she said they don't know what it's really like at Google some of the time. But, if people in their work if they're not happy, and as you said before, if they're not laughing, if they're not smiling, if they're not enjoying their work, that's very sad. But that's not tolerable for very long for any of us.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself increasingly thinking about this. I don't think it was necessarily on my radar before, how we can keep the good stuff in healthcare, but how do we get rid of the stupid stuff? And how do we make positive change in the other areas that are actually meaningful to clinicians? How do we elevate their voices? Because they know the pebbles that are in their shoes. And more often than not, they actually have some really effective solutions. And, I'm reading John Cotter's latest book, Change, that was recommended at Stanford again. And, and I'm thinking about that work and thinking about the steps and what I can do, day to day to kind of meaningfully use that work. But then you turn up, we've just had a changeover week here, not just in Australia, I think, in the UK as well. I'm still seeing things like computer ID badges being cancelled, passwords being changed, and a whole lot of time spent by junior staff trying to reboot and fix these problems. You're seeing staff not getting paid. These are the things that happen again and again in healthcare, which we can do this better. We have to be able to do this better.
Those are huge opportunities. Yeah. Well, and
surely they don't do that at Google.
No, probably not. No, that's probably have that figured out. But we certainly do it in healthcare. One of our well-being directors has recently developed an onboarding survival guide for their Department of Radiology, and all this stuff that you need to know beforehand, checklists, and like a lot of organizations don't do a very good job of that. Yeah. And it doesn't take. If you're trying to get your work done with a patient, you can't log into your computer, and that's going to then mean later in the day, you got to go back. You won't remember what's going on. And by the way, you were hoping to get out of here at a certain time. Too many of those days, they're not good for people. So the question is, as the organizational person, I want to know what didn't go well today, and ask the 5 whys. We don't blame. There's no people to blame. That there's a system problem here. How can we keep that from happening again? Just like we could keep a central line infection from happening. How can we keep what happened to that individual from happening again to another person? Just like a pressure injury, just like any other adverse event. That's an adverse event. Yeah, and if we treat it like an adverse event and do a root cause analysis and say, okay, how can we error-proof that? How can we prevent that error from happening again?
And on the subject of the next generation, because you brought it up, and you are a teacher, mentor, or supervisor, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can. I do think the next generation are they are the future of healthcare, but I think there's so much opportunity there. Love your thoughts, because I did see that work and the slide, the work at Stanford. We were showing the well-being scores and enthusiasm of medical students, and then how we can essentially, through medical training, reverse that trend, which reaches a nadir at mid-residency and then continues to slowly deteriorate through mid-career. And I did, I was quite despondent seeing that work. I think I mentioned on a previous podcast an episode of Kevin MD that I was listening to with a brilliant medical student. She was concurrently studying for an MBA. She had some really good thoughts, and I was most struck by her final kind of parting comments of the conversation, where she called out that all around her, amongst her medical student peers, she sees so much, enthusiasm, investment, really ideas on how we can innovate and change things for the better in healthcare. But then she's looking across, the other side of qualification at the current cohort of clinicians and seeing, this epidemic of burnout and need for wellness. And I do think the opportunity lies with the next generation, but my concern is that they know they have other options and that they might decide, to take them, and we're going to lose, these brilliant people with their ideas.
Oh, I think you should probably flip that a little bit and reframe that a little bit in terms of the next generation will be as resilient as we were, but with better support. Look how much we know about what they're facing. Look at how much we're committed to their lives as physicians being better and more fulfilling. They'll be different. It won't be the same. But I don't know how many people really entered medicine knowing what it was going to be like. It's an unknown. I mean, my niece just had her white coat ceremony as a first-year medical student last Friday, and she doesn't know what it's going to be like to be a doctor. She's full of enthusiasm.
Fantastic.
I would choose to be optimistic about the fact that we're paying so much attention to this. I mean, medicine's always going to be hard, but that's fine. I mean, who wants to do it? It used to be that the major complaint of the American worker was boredom. And I always felt so lucky because I was never bored. I mean, never. And I don't think physicians are bored now. They're tearing their hair out. They're frustrated, but not bored. And so I actually think knowing what we know about the drivers of well-being and fulfillment and translating that into what does that mean for you as a person who's entering this field? Because it's not even the same field, Cheryl. I mean, when I went to medicine, medical knowledge was doubling every 40 years. It's not doubling every 37 days. Medical school is not about memorizing stuff. Medical school is about learning to become a lifelong learner and learning how to learn from other people and how to access information and use it. The practice of medicine bears no resemblance to the practice of medicine 30 years ago. We don't use the same tools. We don't even have all the same diseases. We certainly don't have the same treatments. So I think we need our education system needs to catch up with how we know people should be educated. Our training system needs to catch up with how they should be trained. But over all of it, if we have wellness-centered leadership and we're looking at the people involved in doing this, and we take care of the people, they'll work within the systems and they'll find a way to get their training and their knowledge and step into that next version of what being a practicing physician is. And they'll do well at that. And it will be very different than what I stepped into or what you stepped into and not because they're a new generation, but because the world is a different place. Even to the point where we may find that if we keep choosing people the same way, you're right, they may get into medicine and leave. Maybe we're choosing the wrong people. Maybe it's a different kind of person that should go into medicine, who isn't a scientist, but is a lifelong learner and is an avid knowledge acquirer and an influencer. Maybe those are the people that will make the next generation of physicians that are totally different and totally better. We'll see.
Brilliant. And I think you've answered that last question about, your vision and hope for the future. But is there anything else you would add to that, and particularly the work at Stanford WellMD?
No, I think it's part of, being I view physicians as lifelong learners, and I've been in academic medicine because I really like being around that environment. And so I don't think this is flavor of the month. I don't think that burnout is something we'll eradicate burnout and we'll all be fine. But I think this really is a new evolution in the way that physicians are taught and trained and how they practice and how we deliver care to our patients. We are the leaders of those teams. So I would say that this is focusing on physician well-being is a springboard to transformation of the delivery of healthcare in an entirely different way. And I think it's great that we will be responsible for that development because it'll benefit everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan, for your time. I think this was the conversation I needed to hear and needed to have at this point. And I'm very appreciative for the time that you have given up, and I'm conscious that I have again overrun. I'd like to move on to the closing questions. And I've already asked you about your definitions of well-being, but I'd love to know what brings you most joy and meaning in your work.
So meaning in my work. So there's an exercise that Brian Sexton developed at Duke called 3 Good Things. And if you don't know about it, your listeners should Google that and look it up at the Duke Research Center. And it's a very simple thing. At the end of the day, you get out a notebook and you write down 3 things during the day that were good things. It might be a beautiful sunset. It might be my child got an A on their test. It might be something related to work or whatever. And it doesn't really matter. But ideally, you write it down before the end of the day. And that's proven to improve enhance well-being, reduce depression, reduce burnout in a variety of clinical settings. And if you do it for, I can't remember how many weeks the trial goes on, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something, it can continue to have a benefit 6 months later. And all the research is on the Duke website. Very powerful. And it's a little bit of a training to be aware and mindful, because if you have to think about it at the end of the day, what you find is during the middle of the day, I think, that's something I'm going to put on my list this evening. That was a good thing that happened today. I think that if you ask me what brings me joy and pleasure and bliss, it's almost always interactions with people, especially now at this point in my life and career. So this conversation with you gets on the list for today. Thank you very much. It was on my list all day long, looking forward to it, but this is on the list for today. I would say that as a physician, I like solving problems. In congenital heart disease, we're frequently faced with a baby or a child who has something wrong with their heart. We don't know what it is. So I'm an imager. So I spent my whole career making diagnoses, sometimes challenging, difficult diagnoses, and trying to figure out what to do with that. And I love that. I mean, I love the challenge of a new diagnosis but recognizing that and putting myself in a position where I got to do more of that was great for me. There's a lot of stuff in medicine that I didn't care that much about. But most of the time it comes down to, for me, it's the mostly one-on-one interactions with people. And I would say that was true earlier in my career with my colleagues, with my patients. It's been true in this phase of my career in the leadership roles where not so much leading a meeting, but these one-on-one opportunities to interact with people. But it's different for everybody, Cheryl. There's a guy that I know who runs a meditation company. He's a multi-billionaire guy who went around the world after founding these tech companies, and he found that the richest, most successful people in the world were all unhappy. So he founded a meditation company, and he and I got together and we produced a workshop called Finding Your Bliss as a Physician. And it's very simple. You sit down and put people in pairs and think about a time in the last week where you were doing your clinical job. What were you doing when you felt energized, in flow, when you felt happy and blissful? What were you actually doing at that time? And if you can figure that out, and you can do that 20% of the time, or 10 to 20% of the time, you get really happy. And there's a lot of evidence about this. But part of the trick is you have to recognize it. You have to know what it is and feel it. And then if you can, you got to convince your boss to let you do a little more of that or find a way to do more of that. And I did this little experiment. I was in the echo lab one day with 4 or 5 other cardiologists who had basically the same job. And I gave them this challenge. I said, think about it. Gave them some time to think. And at the end of the time, I asked them, what were you doing when you felt just energized and happy and in flow? I got 4 or 5 different answers. We're all doing the same job, but elements of that job resonated differently with those people. Now, if I'm their boss and I'm making up the schedule or I'm giving out assignments for the day, What's wrong with saying, how can I let you do a little more of this? Counseling this parents of a fetal patient, or going to the operating room, working with the surgeons doing transesophageal echo, or going upstairs to the ICU and working with the teams up there. How teaching the sonographer or the fellow a new skill. The work has to get done. Why not distribute it in a way that makes people feel really good about it today? So whatever makes me feel great, that's great. I recognize it. I try to get that built into my schedule. And when I do it, like right now, I'm aware of it. And I would hope that if people could sort of stop during the course of their day, and you don't need hours and hours of that. You need moments of it. I think the surgeons have an advantage because most surgeons love being in the OR. And unless it's a terribly inefficient OR where they're not able to do their job the way they want to do it, they just get so much benefit out of that. Others of us are in specialties in places where we need to find a little bit more of what is it that brings us that bliss.
I think I'm witnessing a clinician in full flow, just listening to you there. But I think the other thing that you're alluding to there is the other really interesting piece, and certainly was the standout for me in that Mayo Clinic proceedings paper that I spoke about earlier. The idea of this 80-20 rule of professional fulfillment. If you can find that part of your work, that 20%, the sweet spot of the work that gives you most meaning and most joy, and if you can reclaim that, and if you have opportunity to do that part of your work, that is really important in terms of sustaining your longevity of practice, and tolerating the other parts of the job that are less appealing. But I think the other thing that was interesting to me, kind of digging into that, was that it seemed that quite a number of clinicians were struggling to find that part of their work that had most meaning for them. My kind of interpretation was, that does that mean they're so far down the well that they can actually, they've lost sight of it? Because it is there. It was certainly there when we started. And I suppose that also brings in the wellness-centered leadership that we talked about, because part of your job is to help your colleagues find or reclaim that part of their work.
My experience with that, Cheryl, I've talked to a lot of doctors about this. And, if I give them enough time to think, and they really get themselves back in the moment, most physicians can identify those things that they really love doing. They won't know it, but they'll say, "Oh yeah, that's right. Last week I saw that teenager, and there was something going on, and I was late, but I asked her if she'd come back next week and bring her mother with her, and it felt like the right thing to do. And then her mother came, and oh my God, there's all this stuff happening, and if I hadn't done this, I wouldn't have had this." And I love working with that group of kids. But she didn't come up with that for quite a while. So I think that, anyway, and you're right, it's about the leadership thing. It's can we be honest and authentic? Can we, with ourselves and with each other?
Yeah, and I think this has only become more important in recent times, and in our current climate and working environment, where we're increasingly busy, frequently overwhelmed. Many of us have concerns for patient safety and staff safety, on an average shift. And I think I've got several examples, both my own and colleagues, of this now, but I think the most eloquent and poignant was one of my colleagues who's a pediatric emergency physician. I think I had mentioned this story previously. I hope she doesn't mind me sharing it, but I think it is very powerful. Of being on an average evening shift in the winter. It's winter for pediatric emergency medicine at the best of the times, never mind in a pandemic, is challenging. But one of those shifts where you're just trying to hold it together to fight fires, to support your junior staff, and seeing a patient come in with with something that to her is a relatively straightforward problem, after 20 years in clinical practice. But being able to go into the room, close the door, spend some real quality time with a young patient and their family and, make a diagnosis, describe the problem, come up with a management plan and really feel that, you've made a difference and, being able to just shut out everything else for those 15 minutes. And, she just described this so beautifully. And she said, that sustained me for the rest of my shift. And I suspect it probably sustained her for longer than that. And I think those small moments matter. I'm going back again. That was very powerful to me. And I think that we have lost a lot of those moments, and it's important that we reclaim them.
Yeah, when you see this, to spend time with a patient or a family, and when they walk away, know they trusted you, they believed you, they're now reassured. All that fear and anxiety has melted away, and they have a plan and they know where they're going. And that's a powerful thing. And yet, if you can't recognize what you've just done, not accomplished, but what's happened to you and for you, once you recognize it, it just has a powerful impact. And I really believe that can keep you going through an awful lot of those other interactions that maybe aren't as satisfactory. Those other parts of your life, you have to do stuff that's jury duty or scut work or whatever it turns out to be. Yeah, I heard you guys have had a pretty bad winter, and I'm sorry to hear that.
You see, I have a strategic plan to go north to get a bit of summer during winters. That's part of my survival strategy and some good medicine, which fills my cup. Moving on to the topic of books. I know we've spoken a bit about this before, and you recommended a book to me, Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, which I'm currently reading, and it has transported me back to my Scottish and Glasgow roots. It's raw, real and confronting, and I'll let you know how I get on as I progress with that. I think I also mentioned I've just recently read a book here by one of our Melbourne surgeons, The Registrar. So I'm going to send you that because I think you'll enjoy it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd also like to know what else you have read recently, anything pertaining to leadership, any of the topics that we've discussed that you've enjoyed, and I will put them on the book list for the podcast.
Yeah, I liked a book called Nudge.
I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, I liked it because it's sort of about why people do what they do and how to help them do it better. The term that guy uses is paternalistic libertarianism, helping people choose what they would want to choose if they knew what was best for them. Like put the sugary cereal on the top shelf, put the healthy things in front of them. Helping people. And again, it's sort of like that efficiency of practice. Make it easy for people to do the things they want to do. Don't make it hard. Don't make them do workarounds. I like Daniel Kahneman and Daniel Pink's works, Thinking Fast and Slow and Noise. I like learning about the way that our minds work and the way we work together. All of those assumptions and biases that we carry around with us. I just found that, those are leadership books for me, because if I can figure out what's making people tick, I can help them. I can help me help them. Not too many leadership books to me are sort of formulaic. And as I say, that the thing that the best leadership thing I ever got out was sort of the Toyota leadership book. And it was a little triangular or square thing that said what the leader's job is: take care of yourself, take care of others, develop a strategic plan, and participate in continuous improvement. And that if you do that, it's not really complicated.
And we've got a third season of Ted Lasso coming up as well.
I know. I'm looking forward to that. There's a pleasure.
Just finally, because I've taken way too much of your time, I see this beautiful trails behind you that I would be happily running in right now. Describe your ideal self-care Sunday.
Yeah. So I'm a night owl, which means that especially when I'm working hard, I probably end the week a little sleep deprived. And we know we know the value and benefit of sleep hygiene and rest and restoration. So for me, a weekend day that I don't have a lot scheduled or don't have or work responsibilities, I sleep in. I'm a night owl, so I can actually sleep in the morning. I don't spring out of bed at the crack of dawn. And I'm quite happy. I don't feel guilty about it. I feel like it's recharging the batteries. I'm pretty old, so I still get the newspaper delivered. So to sit down and read the Sunday New York Times and read the book reviews and read some things that I wouldn't read otherwise, sit out in the yard and read the newspaper with my wife and a cup of coffee. That's a pretty nice morning for me. My preferred form of exercise is hiking, as you see the trail behind me, and we're fortunate to have lots of places around here to do that. So last Sunday I went out and did about an 8-mile hike up 1,000 feet, and it was tough and it was great. I felt good at the end. Got on top of the mountain and ate a snack and rested and made my way back down, and then to have some time with my wife, or the kids are around in the evening. So family time is nice. So pretty low key, I would say. I found that, through my career, work is 24 hours, 24/7 headspace and a lot of hours. And to give myself the permission and chance to rest and restore. And I've learned in part of this, developing these courses and all is, it's also important to, at the end of an hour, take a few minutes rest, whether you're hiking or you're on Zoom. At the end of the day, to rest and reflect. Treat yourself more like an athlete than like an egghead, and really take care of yourself emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, physically. So an ideal day for me is not a very ambitious day. Although if you think about it, if my list of things to do today is sleep in, drink coffee, read the paper, go for a walk, and have dinner with my wife, that's a pretty full day. I'm pretty happy with that. Oh, I might, and if I were in Australia, it would be watch footy. But footy here is in the middle of the night, not during the day. But I still end up recording it and watching it. So, or maybe I'll watch golf, or I'll watch a little baseball or whatever, or take a nap in the afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all just sounds ideal. And, I've had opportunity to ask all of my guests this question now, and I'm really struck by how similar their responses are. What does it actually take to fill our cups? It's moving and nourishing our bodies. It's connecting with the people that mean most to us, and ideally doing that in natural environments.
I'll give you one more thing, though, is on Sunday, to carve out some time to get ready for Monday, so that when I get to Monday, I'm ready. I don't mind catching up on my emails, making sure that I'm ready for whatever's coming on Monday, and so that I don't hit Monday behind. I actually like that. I like feeling prepared, and I don't resent that time. So even that time, if I'm well rested and I'm getting ready for Monday morning to start the week, not feeling like I'm running behind, that's a great thing too.
Thank you. Another pearl. I was just thinking there, given that we have gone on quite a bit of time, just like you had on the Wellbeing Directors course, I really should have had a playlist and opportunities to stop, get up, move and have a dance. I thoroughly enjoyed that about the course. Thank you again. This has just been wonderful.
That's all right. This has really been a pleasure for me.
You have been listening to the Mindful Medic podcast with Dr. Daniel Murphy. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did having it. I'll put a link, as discussed, in the show notes to some of the websites, resources, and specific articles that we reference to this conversation. I also mentioned a book that I've recently read and thoroughly enjoyed, The Registrar by Dr. Neela Janakaramanan, who is a Melbourne-based plastic surgeon. I devoured this book in 6 hours, and I'll put a link to it. Thoroughly recommended read. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback. I'll also put a link to the upcoming Australasian Doctors' Health Conference, which is going to be hosted by the South Australian team this year and be based in Adelaide. I'll be attending and presenting, and I hope to have the South Australian team headed up by Kiara and Roger, who are organising this year's event, to come on a future episode to talk a bit about what we can expect this year. So look forward to joining you next time. Till then, take care.
I view physicians as lifelong learners, and I've been in academic medicine because I really like being around that environment. And so I don't think this is flavor of the month. I don't think that burnout is something we'll eradicate burnout and we'll all be fine. But I think this really is a new evolution in the way that physicians are taught and trained and how they practice and how we deliver care to our patients. We are the leaders of those teams. So I would say that this is focusing on physician well-being is a springboard to transformation of the delivery of healthcare in an entirely different way. And I think it's great that we will be responsible for that development because it'll benefit everybody.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.